Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I am joined by Ken Good. We're going to have some chat about crime in America, what it means, where it's going. This was a huge issue in the election, all this type of thing, and there's a lot of myths about crime in America. If you talk to some people, the stats will say crime is down. If you talk to a lot of people who are in cities and all this type of thing, they will tell you crime is skyrocketing. It's through the roof. And as someone who had their car broken into 3 times in downtown Seattle, I can speak to that and the many thousands of dollars I spent on crime in Seattle. So we're going to break through some myths and break through some ideas and all this type of thing with the perfect expert. So welcome, Ken, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Well, why don't we start from the beginning? Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into studying this?
Okay, my name is Ken. I am an attorney. I am 63 years old. I have, let's see. So I started out practicing law, representing doctors in hospitals, and then I've always been doing appellate type stuff. I've argued cases before the Supreme Court of Texas, the Court of Criminal Appeals in Texas, because we have two high courts. But because of my appellate stuff, there was a bail bondsman that got some issues, and so he asked somebody, "Who do you hire?" So they said, "We need an appellate attorney, and I've got a good one." So they called me, and then after that, word of mouth spread, and I've started representing bail bondsmen across the state of Texas. I'm Texas counsel for several insurance entities, and then I'm on the board of directors of the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. And we propose bills. We're a resource to the Texas legislature. And then, the reason why I've gotten this interest on crime is because, we've had all these groups file lawsuits across the country alleging or trying to use lawfare to impose criminal justice reform. And so someone asked me to go to a hearing in a case in Harris County in Houston, Texas. And I did, and I was offended. I was offended greatly. I thought the judge was making a wrong ruling. I thought she was applying the law incorrectly, and she didn't even understand how bail worked. And so I came out of the hearing, and I started calling all my friends and allies and saying we need to become experts on these issues because it's obvious that nobody else is. And so I set about to do that using my appellate background. And ultimately, I was proven right on that judge because on that case, she was ultimately reversed 6, 7, or 8, or 9 times. But that is one of the seminal cases that these groups push, saying that we should have criminal justice reform, we should have bail reform. And so I've written numerous articles across the country on crime. And I recently wrote one, on bail reform. And I recently wrote an article for the Attorney at Law magazine on the FBI crime stats. And it's very interesting because like 9 days after the article was published, my article questioned whether they were accurate. And suddenly they amended their crime stats to show that crime was actually higher than what they were saying.
Yes, I was just reading. I'm so glad you brought that up because I was just reading about it here in the page. I got it, all this sort of thing. So why don't we start from the very beginning? Why don't you walk us quickly through bail? What is it, and why has the criminal justice reform movement lit upon that as a hot issue? Because that was something that Vice President Harris in her time as California AG had been dealing with and as prosecutor had talked about, and she had talked about that on the campaign. So why don't we talk about the intersection of bail? What is it, and why does it matter to criminal justice reform?
Well, really, I think that bail has been attacked because it's an easy target. Everybody wants to get rid of the private industry bail system, but the problem is there's not an alternative that does anything on the same level as the private industry, and that's the reason why it's been around for 200 years. So, what is bail? So, if you get arrested, either they file charges or it's just on a probable cause affidavit awaiting to determine if they're going to file charges, they can really release you on bail. So that's either on a private surety bond or it's on some type of simple release. It depends on where you are in the country, on what they call it. So, in Texas, they call it a personal bond. So in California, they call it release on zero bail. In New York, they call it release on no bail. But those are all just your promise that you'll come back. So what's the purpose of bail is it is the security you give the court that you will return to answer the charges that have been filed against you. It doesn't have anything to do with guilt or innocence. It's what assurance you're giving that you will return. And so we've got the
Which
private
is the sum
industry.
of money, of course.
Well, it can be premium, just like on any insurance policy, or it can
Mhm.
be just your promise on these simple release mechanisms. The
Right.
what we're seeing in this bail reform movement is there's a shift and a move to use simple release much more heavily, but it has a much higher failure to appear rate. So,
Right.
and in criminal cases, if you don't show up for court, they issue a warrant, but your case gets put on hold. And so it can't go forward until you come back. And so if your failure to appear rate starts going up, then backlogs increase. And so, like using simple release in California on misdemeanor courts, I've had a DA tell me on a podcast that they have an 80% failure to appear rate. Harris
Mm.
County in Houston, Texas does simple release for misdemeanors most, and they have it over 80% failure to appear rate over 2 years on average, and according to HarrisCountyCourtWatch.com. And the private industry has a less than 10% failure to appear rate. So you can see the difference is dramatic. And so what's the impact of that? The more we use these simple release mechanisms, creates chaos. Chaos creates pressure to dismiss because, like in California, they have a Speedy Trial Act. If they don't come back within a certain time, their case has to be dismissed. So it puts pressure to dismiss cases. Dismissing cases is perceived by criminals as a green light to commit more crime.
Right. Well, and also I think going along with that is if you have people not coming back in, and we know that it a lot of these, especially repeat offenders, tend to be the same people,
Oh yeah, yeah,
to the same 2 to 500 people, sort of thing,
absolutely.
in any given localized area, sort of thing. Then obviously that's going to cause an increase in crime because the criminals are still out and about,
Yes,
walking
that's right.
around, committing the crime. So
Yeah. Well, and just
yes,
think about it. If you get high on drugs, we're releasing you back into the community before you even come down off your high.
yes, yeah, I mean, yeah. It's like we've arrested you for methamphetamine. Well, the outlet, it's like they weren't even sober by the time they got home to get high again. This is
Mm-hmm.
not making a lot of sense.
It's not.
So yes, so now that we kind of have that whole thing established, when it comes to crime in America, is it up? Is it down? What's the story? Because there's been a lot said by a lot of people. What's your view?
Well, okay, my view I think is it's crimes up, especially in our urban areas. Crimes up dramatically. You want to look at the statistics on car thefts. That's the best place to look because the insurance companies still won't pay off a carjacking claim without a police report. So that's probably the most accurate. And those are through the roof. But, for the last two election cycles, because 2 years ago we had the midterm elections,
Yeah.
that crime was a big issue. And 2 years ago, just like today, or just like this cycle, the left was saying crime's not up. Just look at the FBI statistics. So, I mean, it's a perception problem. I mean, I did a debate with a representative of this civil rights court law firm that's filing all these lawsuits across the country where they keep getting reversed on appeal. And they say, oh, no, it's just a perception issue. Crime is not up. You're just perceiving more crime. You're seeing it, but it's not really real. But the problem is, this is what they're lying to you about on the FBI statistics. The FBI changed the way they collect data 4 or 5 years ago, and they went to a new system. And so all the police departments in the country had to get new equipment to report to them. And so it's been a process. And so their data is not complete. And as more and more people get the new equipment, then it will fill out. But the scientists are even saying that data is not complete. The two largest police departments in the country, the LA and New York, aren't even reporting to them yet. And so for one party to come out and use that, and that's the only thing that they've been using to argue that crime is not up. And then, like 30 days ago, weeks before the election, FBI quietly updated their statistics, and instead of showing crime going down, they showed it going up. And it's just a little bit up, but again, their data is not complete. As I noted in my article, there's other government agencies that track crime. CDC tracks homicides. They show homicides is up 20%, and that's completely different than what the FBI statistics show. And the DOJ has surveys on crime they've been doing for decades, and those surveys show crimes up dramatically, as was pointed out by Trump. And so you see when the FBI updated their crime data statistics, Harris's campaign immediately stopped talking about crime and immediately went and said Trump is Hitler, Trump is a fascist, and that's all we heard for the next week. And it was really because they had nothing else to argue on crime. They never talked about crime again during until the election or through the election.
Yeah. So this is obviously, I mean, has been a big point of from the social justice movement and about social justice for a long time. And when it comes to, the cash bail system and how we enforce crime and all this type of thing, there is this argument that
Mhm.
when you get tough on crime, this adversely impacts the poor and communities of color. And I say the poor to include everybody in community of color specifically, because poor white people can get caught up in all this too. And so when it comes to this society perception that crime is up, we have to get tough on crime and really crack down on it. Um, what in your opinion, how do we find that balance between creating the safe cities and communities we want without necessarily going into that adverse impact on communities of color, low income communities, all this type of thing? Is there a way to balance that at all, do you think?
Well, first of all, I reject that argument completely because that argument says that our black brown communities cannot have public safety
Yeah.
because the Minnesota police departments, they started tracking crime, and they started tracking it all the way from what's the race of the person calling in the crime all the way through to conviction.
Mm,
And they released their first study in 2022, and they found that there was a disproportionate amount of the black and brown communities reporting crimes, and the people they were reporting were black and brown. So there was a disproportionate amount of crime being committed by those communities on those communities. And
right.
so, but once those people got into the criminal justice system, their results were better now than white people that were going through the system. And so that report showed to me we have a disproportionate amount of crime being committed by certain racial groups, but once they get into the criminal justice system, currently they're being treated better than other races. And so I think what we should be talking about is we why do we have a disproportionate amount of crime being committed by certain racial groups? I mean, look at murder rates. In the
Yeah.
United States right now, 50% of all murders are on young black males. And by and
Yes.
large, they're being committed on young black males. And
Right.
how in this debate did we decide that we're going to favor the young black male murderer over the young black male victim, the murderee? And,
Yeah.
and that's the problem we have. So, how do we find a middle ground? We provide public safety. And I mean, to me, because the problem is when crime starts increasing, it increases in a disproportionate amount. It goes up quicker in our minority communities. And so right now, with all this reform that's going on and crimes going up in our urban areas, it's gone up even more, much more quickly in our in our urban cities, in our minority communities. And you can double score that with the election results. The urban
Right.
areas saw the largest increase of votes for a Republican candidate for president than there's probably ever. And why do you think that is?
Oh. Well,
Crime.
no, I mean it's no secret. The mismanagement of major cities for the Democratic Party is a huge problem, has been a huge problem. And bearing in mind, I lived in deep blue Seattle for 10 years.
Mhm.
So I know you probably haven't listened to the show, but you might guess where my political leanings lie, based upon that I lived in deep blue Seattle for 10 years. Um, and I have to say, I was And in 2020, with the whole defund the police thing, Seattle went off the deep end on that.
Absolutely,
It
absolutely.
wasn't great. Okay. In the intro to your segment, I talk about my car got broken into 3 times. That happened in downtown Seattle. Like
Sure.
I was on the front line of the increase in crime coming out
Well,
of that whole
but
discussion.
look at what they've done on drugs.
Yeah.
We're going to support people with programs. We're not going to put them in the criminal justice system. So what have we done? We have record numbers of people overdosing every month, and so we're bringing them back to life so they can go back and see their drug dealer. I mean, we're not. They're electing to go to rehab or seek treatment 0.01 or 0.01% of the time. I mean, for God's sake, where's all that money going? Because nobody's using the programs, and we've lost
Right.
the hammer. I mean, I've actually had people argue to me, well, we live in a free society though, so if they want to overdose on drugs, they have that right. No, we can't have that be our position as a society. I mean, look at Portland and where drug use went from 6%. They
Yeah, it's out of
it went
control.
at 12%. So finally, they allowed all those drug laws where they are no longer prosecuting heavy drug use. They let them expire. I mean, we have to have the hammer of the criminal justice system for these people to seek rehab. I mean, rehab has a 75% failure rate the first time you go. So you got to
Right.
have that hammer every time to send them back until it takes, or they say they're not going to, and you send them to jail. I mean, the public has to be protected from people. I mean, that is part of the criminal justice system.
No, I was about to bring that up and said I think there's a popular feeling, and as towards the end of my time in Seattle, when I was going with this one, you did this perfectly. You're so good at this. And towards the end, I was kind of like, I don't mean to be a tough on crime guy because that's not usually my jam. But I've spent $3,000 in getting my
Sure.
car fixed all the time. I actually put my car in storage for the last 6 months I was in Seattle. I literally rented a garage, put my car in storage, and went car free for 6 months because I was just like, it's cheaper. It's only $88 a month. I'll be money ahead.
Yeah.
Windows are not cheap. So, towards the end, I was kind of like, yeah, I'm really tired of living 2 blocks from an open air drug market. I'm so glad that the lady who used to sit on the couch in front of the courthouse, the King County Courthouse, they finally like kind of moved her along to go smoke crack somewhere else, like all this type of thing. It really made one of my favorite cities and one of my places on the planet
Yeah.
very unlivable. And I enjoyed living there. And I think it was also really tough because I lived in the International District, which is kind of south of town, and it is historically predominantly Asian, predominantly Chinese.
Hmm.
And it was really kind of a city crisis because a lot of the Asian American community felt like the city of Seattle was kind of dumping the problem on them because that's where it was all kind of concentrating was in that
Sure.
neighborhood. And that's where I lived, incidentally.
Well, I mean,
And
I look at it.
it
Why?
was really tough. It was really hard. And it was really hard to say, yeah, we need to do more. Like it was really hard for me to come along and say, like, yeah, I don't mean to be a tough on crime guy, but honestly, we need to get tough on crime. And it was kind of a
Mhm.
political transformation in deep blue liberal Seattle for us to finally say, all right, let's get tough on crime. Like we're doing this now. Like we need to get tough on crime. Like, and I think that's where most of the country's at is I think people have really had it with how far we've kind of let things go with antisocial
Sure.
behavior and all this type of thing.
Absolutely. Well, I would make 2 points on that. The first one is, we're kind of just repeating the same cycle we've already been through before in the 60s. In the 60s, feeling safe, so we became more forgiving on our criminal laws, and then crime started increasing, and so we had this fight or dilemma on how to address it. And we had one party refused to participate and refused to do anything, and so nothing got done for a period of time. And so then what happened? We had the backlash, and the backlash brought us Reagan, and with the war on drugs. And I would just, the point that you made about Seattle, and it's been going on for so long. I would say the second point I would make is, what is the motivation of our politicians for this change? Because, a normal politician, if they try something, if it doesn't work, then we go, hey, this didn't work. We got to try something else. So
Yeah.
the motivation here is not that it didn't work, because we all know it didn't work. We've been knowing for years, and they wouldn't change it. And so I really think that the motivation here is the people that are the activists that are pushing for these things. They know that the largest budget item in a county is law enforcement. So if they can give the county a reason to reduce that, they can then move those funds because they're not going to cut it. They're not going to save it. They're going to move those funds to other social programs. And where else would be best for that than Seattle? Because they're, like a blue state, they would want to save money and reinvest it, what they would argue is in our social programs. And that's what they did. But the problem is it was a political strategy, not something that actually has any science to support that it would work.
And that was, I mean, that got reflected in the last mayoral election I was around for. I moved in the fall of 23. And it was, and things definitely, took a turn in terms of we wanted to finally handle the stuff. And I think, and I don't know how you feel about this, but one of the good things I think has come out of this is not using the police for every job, including more social workers and things. Denver's had a lot of success with that sort of thing, from what I have read. And I know that Seattle has tried that sort of thing as well. One man was very famously standing on a telephone pole on Aurora Avenue, and they got him to come down, which was a good thing. All this type of thing. I think there are maybe some good spots, but I think letting the criminals run amok, I mean, how you handle the criminals may change, but let's still handle them.
Yeah,
Let's
let's
not just
handle
let them run amok, sort of thing. So I think there's maybe some good things that have come out of this whole conversation, but we can't leave these people to the road, is my
Absolutely,
point. Yeah.
absolutely. And the problem with sending social workers instead of police is you've got to have a very effective and very good triage program, because
Yeah.
how do you know based on a phone call? Well, I'm going to send a social worker this time and not a policeman.
Right.
And what happens if someone starts shooting? What happens if the social worker gets shot? I mean, that's my biggest criticism of that uh, social experiment, because
Right.
one social worker gets shot and killed, they're suing the county and the program's over.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's too heavily based on triage. And if you're having to spend any time at all to decide, then you're too late.
Yeah. No, I think that's, I mean, yeah, I think that's a very interesting kind of idea and concept. And I think that's a good, I mean, I think that point's well taken, in terms of you don't know what you don't know until you get there, sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, and
But then,
when I mean, but
yeah.
the social worker for one situation may be good, and it's not going to be for another. I mean,
And how do you know
look
which
at
one's which?
how do you know which
Yeah.
one, and even within the same situation, do you know what the biggest reason why we have shootouts at the courthouse in Texas? You would think it'd be a criminal case and someone got mad, they didn't want to go to jail. No, it's family cases, it's divorces.
I was gonna say
Fighting
it's
over.
a divorce all day and night.
Oh
It's
yeah,
got to be
yeah,
family court and
yeah.
divorce. Like,
Yeah. I told somebody one time or somebody told me one time, when you get a divorce, you go crazy. And so you're crazy for a period. And I really believe that. And I've never done divorce at all, because I'll have nightmares that whatever the crazy things that people are doing to each other in the divorce case, my wife will on one day do to me. And I would rather sleep at night than have those nightmares.
yes, no, I don't blame you. I don't blame you. When it comes to the criminal justice system itself, there has been, as I'm sure you know, the idea that, this system kind of takes people in, eats people up, spits them out, and there's not enough stuff afterwards to reintegrate them back into society, all this type of thing. How do you feel about reforming how the system works as a part of long-term crime prevention? What's your opinion about that?
Well, I think, the private surety bail system is so intertwined with the criminal justice system. Usually, whatever's good for the criminal justice system is good for the bail industry. But you have to understand what the bail industry does, gets the person to court so that the victim can have justice, so the case can get resolved. And so by using the private surety bail system, the case will get resolved quicker. I had a judge tell me one time she just did an experiment and she just used simple release for a period of time, and she found that for every 8 weeks that's all she used, she created a whole week's worth of new work for her court because of the failures to appear, having to put cases on hold, finally get them back. And so just the type of release will affect your ability to resolve cases. And so I think the first thing is you got to get people to court so that cases can be resolved. Now, once the case is resolved, they've pled guilty, they go to prison, they go to the county jail for a period of time. Absolutely, I'm in favor of anything, but I've done some interviews with people, and the problem with reforming that too much is We're all in favor of individual assessments, and if you have reformed, we want you released. But the government can't afford, can't pay for, and can't do individual assessments. So look at the First Step Act that Trump did in his first 4 years in office. It was
Yeah.
across the board reform. They didn't do any individual assessments. So the problem is when we do reforms like that, they're not really ever good. They're just across the board releases, and that causes crime to increase. So we need to look for new ways to do it. But when we're looking for new ways, we're getting pushed by these activist groups, and they'll do pseudoscience and say, "Oh, this works." That's never been studied, and it never works. And so you can't tell the difference between the two anymore.
Yeah, and that's why we kind of wanted your ideas. Is what happens oftentimes, as you've just mentioned, is one small location they'll try something, it seems to have worked, and people want to press it out nationwide.
Yeah.
We're a large country of 300, almost 50 million people. What works
Well,
over here may not work over there so well, and
Well,
so
Harris County is a great example in Houston, Texas. So they filed suit in this case that I've already talked about, and they
yeah.
entered into a settlement, which was ultimately overruled, even though they're still following it to this day. But the things that they agreed to do in the settlement are terrible things. You have to miss court 3 times before they can do anything to you. And we've already said each time they miss court, your case gets put on hold. And it's a charge-based release mechanism. So you get arrested for car theft, you get released on a simple release, no matter how many times you do it. I mean, you can do it 10 times and you're still going to get the same simple release because it's a charge-based release mechanism. I mean, the Texas legislature would say that's a failure. The judges in Harris County would say it's a failure. But the activists take what they're doing in Harris County and take it to other states and argue with a straight face. This is the gold standard of reform. It's working great in Harris County. It's what you should impose statewide in your state, in Ohio. And then we have to go and say, they're lying to
No, not
you.
so
They're just
fast.
lying to you.
Yeah. No, I mean, but this is so good because there are a lot of myths about a lot of this stuff
Mhm.
that gets talked about and all this type of thing. And so it's good to finally have this conversation. And a lot of my listenership is not going to be happy to hear a lot of this, but that's okay. No, it's good for
Yeah.
them. I do this all the time with them. No, we go there here. We go there here to be like, no, we're going to hear the uncomfortable thing, grab a drink, get
Well,
something to eat.
but
We're going to have this conversation and find out what the real truth is so that we can have a functioning society.
But let
So
me
this is
make you.
good. It's good
But
for
let me
them.
make a point to the hardcore listeners that say they completely disagree with me because I want to make a point with them that I think that maybe they have not thought of because we're giving up on misdemeanors in this country now. I mean, California, you can't be
Mm,
forced to go on a misdemeanor. So, but the problem with that is the misdemeanors today are the training ground for tomorrow's felonies.
mhm.
And so if we would wake up and we would hold people accountable, starting with misdemeanors, going all the way to felonies, then these defendants there would be some of them that would turn around and become productive citizens who are not because they're not getting that pressure and they are getting put in a much worse position than they otherwise would have been in because of criminal justice reform and bail reform. And I don't think that the public realizes that and would support it if they did.
No, I think that's an excellent point. And I mean, it kind of feeds back into that old-fashioned broken windows theory of policing.
Yeah.
If you go after the small stuff, it prevents the big stuff from happening, sort of thing.
It
It's
does.
like,
It does. And that was I mean, that is a tested and true proven method for fighting crime. It is one of the theories we teach in our colleges. It worked well in California, and that's the reason why it was attacked. It was attacked by activists because it was successful. It was accused of being racist. And you know what? They quit using it, but it went through the courts and it was upheld. And it was upheld as a proper policing mechanism that could be used. It's just they don't want it. I mean, activists
well,
that
that's how
oppose
Giuliani
crime.
cleaned up New York City, which,
Absolutely.
was in not great condition when he arrived. And and it was, let's do everything. Let's even the small stuff and the city will be better for everyone sort of thing.
Well, there's a
So
case that kind of proves his point. It kind of underscores it. There was a case called Sanchez versus Alabama where they had to live under one of these injunctions that said you can't hold anybody. You just have to do simple release for misdemeanors and felonies. And the county said, we're appealing. So they had to live under it for 4 years before the Court of Appeals addressed it and said, you're right, they're wrong. We're reversing. And so I did a podcast with the sheriff, so the case came back. They took back control over their criminal justice system, and the sheriff said, "We re-implemented a system of accountability, and we quickly told defendants, if you don't come to court, there are consequences." And what do you know? Within 6 months, crime started going down. We know how to fight crime. We just have to get the people that are pushing mumbo jumbo, which is really so that they can move money into other social programs, and we can bring back our society to have public safety. I mean, if even the Mayor Adams in New York, I mean, he's not a champion for anti bail reform or for fighting criminal justice reform, but he made the comment that one of the foundations of society is public safety. And if you can't provide public safety, then you don't have a society. And I would say right now in some of our urban areas and in Seattle right now, you don't have a society because you got too much crime.
no, that is definitely, a point well taken. What do we do with, you know, full jails and full prisons and the social ramifications of that? What I mean, kind of what do we do on the other end of that? I guess is probably one big
Well,
question.
part of the problem we have in California right now is we just don't have enough capacity in our prison system because
California doesn't have enough capacity for a lot of things: electricity, water, prison.
well, but a lot of that's
They
their own
just need
creation.
more space for
But
everything in California.
But it's their every one of those are problems that they've created for themselves. Like on the prison system,
Absolutely.
the courts capped it at 130 something percent of their capacity, and so that forced them to release a lot of people. Well, they told people, "Oh, you're going to be safer by us releasing more criminals," even though I think one of the Supreme Court justices at the U.S. Supreme Court wrote in his dissent, "You're releasing the equivalent of a division into society, and they're all convicted criminals. And so, of course, you're going to have crime. That's what's happened everywhere that's been done." And so the dissent was saying we can't sanction releasing criminals back into society. So their problem, everything they've done in California has been to reduce the number of people in their prison because they're unwilling to build additional capacity. And so until they decide to build additional capacity, and that's been a problem so long. I mean, Schwarzenegger set aside money to build additional capacity, and they wouldn't approve it. So I mean, that's been going on for many, many years, and it's going to be a problem again because they just rolled back Prop 47, and which is the one that ultimately said we're not going to prosecute theft under $950. And Gascon was defeated by 20 something points. And so what do you do? I mean, you've got to hold people accountable, but you got to have the infrastructure to do it. And that's the ultimate irony. You've got activists that are pushing to decrease the capacity of the prison system to backdoor force criminal justice reform. We don't have anywhere to put them. Well, yeah, because you close this prison or you
Right.
refuse to build a prison. So, I mean, I'm probably hardcore, but I'm like, until crime starts going down, we don't have enough prisons.
No. I mean no. That was why I wanted to kind of look at the system, the pipeline, all the way through the snake, from
Mm-hmm.
mouth to tail, sort of thing, um, and go from and
But
kind of
the
go from
problem is
there.
once the mentality changes, once people understand they'll be held accountable,
Yeah.
then your prison population will fall. And then you can start closing facilities. I mean, build new and then close your oldest as they go down. But until we change that mentality, because right now misdemeanors are the training ground for tomorrow's felonies, and the prisons right now are full of hardcore felons.
Yeah. No, that's yeah. And as I mentioned before, I think it's also so important to have good ways of reintegrating people back into society.
Sure.
That's where I think we can do a tremendous social good, um, and
Well,
try to prevent the
I,
crime of tomorrow.
I think we need to outsource that because then we have churches or other groups that can do the
Oh, of course, yeah.
individual
Local
assessments.
charity,
But
yes, local charities are
we
fabulous
can't.
at that.
Absolutely. And, I mean, I just look at the AA
Nothing a good
program.
faith-based organization can't solve.
I know. Well, but I
Yeah,
look at the Alcohol Anonymous program where, it has tremendous success. And, alcoholism, one of the hardest types of drug use programs that you can overcome. But it is based on a belief in some type of God. It doesn't, you don't have to believe in God, but you need to believe in some type of uh, some
higher
type of
power, greater,
higher
something
power.
greater than
That's
yourself. Yeah,
yes, and that's a large part of that. And so we need some programs like that. And I talked to the sheriff of Harris County one time, and I said, "What do the people in your jail share any common things?" And he said they share three things. Number one, there's no dad in their life. Number two, they don't have an education, and number three, uh, they have either mental or drug issues. And so you get them in prison, if you can address the school and you can agree, if you can get their family to try to integrate some type of support system, you're two-thirds of the way of integrating them back. I mean, the problem is once you get into prison, families usually write you off, but they're not writing you off just suddenly. They've written you off because you're a career criminal at that point, and they've been burned by you so much. I have a sister who had a car accident in 1989. She broke every bone in her face. She had a 30-year drug addiction to prescription drugs. So it was still legal drugs, but still was killing her. And at the end of her life, I mean, there was a period of time where I just couldn't have anything to do with her. But when her husband died, I stepped in, had her declared incompetent, and then we put her in an assisted living facility where they managed her drugs. And the last 4 years she was alive, probably some of the best years she ever had.
yeah. No, I mean, it is each one of those. I used to work at a holistic rehab center, and it was the business manager, but I heard everything because I, saw all the paperwork and the financials, and so I knew everything that happened. That was part of the job, was to know everything that was going on. And yeah, each person had their own unique story, their own unique tale. And yeah, and some often, I mean, if I had a dollar for every exasperated family member phone call I would get to our facility, you and I could take a nice vacation somewhere with your whole family and my whole
Yeah.
family. And so yeah, I mean, it's definitely a part of that, and
But
that's
the problem that we have right now is
it's a big difficulty.
well, one of the problems we have is the mental health system that you've mentioned is
Yeah,
not intended to be integrated with the criminal justice system because the mental health system is based on we reaffirm what you're saying, we support what you're saying, we take what you're saying at face value. Well, the career criminals learn how to manipulate that so easily. Oh yeah, I've got
yeah,
mental problems, I'm depressed, and and so okay. So where we're trying these reforms, well, then that would be a reason to dismiss the case because they've got mental issues, and so smart criminals learn that, and we don't really have any systems. The mental health system is not meant to police whether you're being genuine on your mental issues. You know what I mean?
No, I do. I mean, I've had, obviously in my work in that facility and elsewhere, I've known quite a few people in all of that, and the the mechanisms and whatnot you have to go through running a facility like that to out manipulate the master
Mm-hmm.
manipulators that you're
Mm-hmm.
working with is quite tremendous. We had every day, we at
Mm-hmm.
about 7:30, 8 o'clock, we had a whole team meeting. And I'm the business manager. I'm the number, but still, we all meet together to find out what had been said, what had gone on, so that nobody could split what we called split the treatment team. You couldn't,
Absolutely, yeah.
try to. So yeah, so we all we're constantly texting, calling. So and such happened. Don't let them tell you otherwise. Here's what really happened, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
All this to get around that. And some people were dismissed from the program because they were just kind of too much to handle all this type of thing. The only place where I found that ironically enough seemed to not be much of an issue. I knew a psychologist who were in Washington. They have an island where they keep all the sex offenders. I forget what it's called, but you have to take a ferry to get there. And he worked there, and he was surprised by, honestly, barring how awful these people were in their lives, how kind of calm and chill it was compared to other places he'd worked, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which was just kind of interesting. But I mean, I agree with you. There's definitely, I think, certain approaches you have to take in that, with you're here because of this crime, that's not good. Faulty thinking got you here. We need to address that. And
Well,
we
but we
cannot deal
just
with anything else until we address that.
Well, we just think mental health, oh, we're going to be sympathetic. I mean, the mental health spectrum is so broad. I mean, it
Yeah.
includes like you said, master manipulators. And, and I think of those as really, really smart people who have no moral compass. So they're willing to say or do anything. And those people, can get really, they're willing to do anything so they can get into the criminal justice system. And I
Yeah.
mean, are they mentally deficient so that they're disqualified from going forward in a criminal case? I would say no, but with the reforms that are getting pushed right now, that claiming that would be a grounds in certain areas where we've pushed reform, that would be just a grounds for dismissing their criminal case because we're going to have a sympathy for them. Well, I mean, like other areas, they see that as a green light. We can commit more crime.
Yeah. So, as we bring this to a close, this has been fascinating, by the way, and thank you so much for coming on. And we had
Sure.
a bit of a late start today, so thank you so much for bearing with. If you could wave a magic wand and just, do massive reform nationwide and everyone had to go along with it, what are the top three things you would do to dramatically reduce crime in this country?
Well, people are going to laugh when I say this, but I would say I would require courts to use more private surety bonds because they have the lowest failure to appear rate. So you can have fewer courts and get cases resolved more quickly. And I think that's, if you're going to be these simple release mechanisms and you have 50% failure to appear, you're going to have twice the number of courts to resolve the same number of cases. So from a financial standpoint, at no cost to the state or the county, you can get cases resolved more quickly by just saying anyone that can afford it or their family can afford it, you've got to get a private surety bond. Now, granted, for the Constitution, people who are poor and first time offenders, then you have to consider alternatives. Simple have a criminal history, then they're not in jail if they can't afford the bond because they're poor. They're there because of their criminal history. The second
Yeah.
thing I would do would be accountability. I mean, if you want to give them a personal bond or a simple release mechanism, if they don't show up first time, then they're not getting another one because that's the whole concept of accountability. My court is getting put on hold. I can't do other cases because I set aside time for their case and they didn't show up. So now you're going to be at my convenience, not me at yours. And so I might give you a private surety bond the second time if I gave you a simple release the first. But if you don't come back a second time, and I promise if you had three chances, you're being held until your case is over. I don't care because you violated my orders. So I think that gets cases resolved. I think that I don't have any problem with taking into consideration anything that says there's an excuse for why about the crime or people who say we're reformed or programs to reform people. But I think so I think accountability is very important and holding people accountable when they don't show up for court. And if they don't, there has to be there has to be consequences for their actions. And if you do that, crime will go down and it may have a temporary spike in putting people in prison. But then the word gets around because, in Seattle, there's, like, as you've pointed out, there's a city within the city. There's the criminals, the small group of criminals that are living inside the bigger community of
Yeah.
people that want to follow the law. But in the gray area between the two, there's a lot of people that are looking around going, am I going to follow the law today or am I going to follow the lawbreakers today? And when we have all these reforms where they're giving them a green light to commit more crime, there's a whole bunch of people in the gray area that are saying, I'm seeing there's no consequences, so I'm going to do it too. When we start holding people accountable and when there's consequences, that group stops and
Mm.
says, I'm going to follow the law. And that's what we need to
Deterrence
do.
is real. Deterrence is real.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
And when these groups, we're one of the things I was arguing for the last 6 months is, we have all these arguments for identity politics, and that's been going on for years. And so I'm like, we'll continue that next election. This election needs to be about crime, immigration, and vote for those issues. And then once we get both parties back to law and order, which is they usually are, then we can go back and have our normal fights over identity politics. And I really think this is the first election where the pendulum started swinging dramatically back to the right, and because people were tired of crime, they're tired of the immigration situation, and tired of inflation, cost of groceries, and so for the first election, the abortion issue didn't make up for the problems they were having on those issues.
No, I agree, and I've said as much in my post-election coverage because I primarily do news politics. That's what the bulk of this show's about.
Mhm.
So I did an election night live stream. I've done the last couple weeks have been it's been a long 10 days.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so
I'm going to tell you my
yes.
favorite meme is there's a meme going around where Trump is in his McDonald's apron and he's got the little uh, fry thing and he's turned it over and it's like 2 weeks ago he was a humble fry cook and today he's president-elect of the United States of America.
I've seen that one. I've seen that one. Yeah, it's been a long 10 days since the election. And so yeah, no, I absolutely agree with your assessment. It was inflation, it was immigration, it was, crime, especially in urban areas. Nobody wants to live around crime. One of the things I worry about, and I start to sound very Republican when I say this, but I used to be Republican, so it's not hard for me to do. Is I worry that's like we're turning into South Africa, we're turning into Brazil, where the middle and upper classes live in walled communities, everyone else is kind of stuck out with the criminals sort of thing, and you have this you have this situation where the law isn't enforced well enough or good enough by the government, so private people take it into their own hands,
Oh
and you
yeah.
end up with a very two-tiered society. And I had read an article leading into the election talking about Brazilization, and that's not the country any of us are used to living in.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the country the vast majority of people want to live in.
Or will.
Yes, and so I think there's an opportunity to get off that path. I don't think
Yeah, I
any
agree.
of us want to live in Brazil or South Africa.
Well, I agree with that, and I would make just a little bit
No
different.
offense to Brazil and South Africa, but
I would make just a small different point is, I'm very hopeful on criminal justice reform and bail reform being turned around because what we're doing right now is not sustainable and our public will demand public safety. And if you think about it, our criminal laws were there to protect the criminals from, the posse, from
vigilante justice.
vigilante justice. And so, if our government will not provide us with public safety, we will provide our own through vigilante justice, and we don't want that. So the government will come around because there's no other choice. And the last point I'd make is you're going to see it from our urban cities because the impact that this is all having on our commercial properties is just incredible. Properties in San Francisco that are selling for 30 to 50% of what they sold for 3 or 4 years ago. Minneapolis, 2 buildings sold for 9% of what they sold for the last time they sold. And the default rate of commercial properties has gone from 5% to 40 something percent. I mean, that will kill the taxes that are being paid in our urban cities. So the mayors in our urban cities, they'd already started it, but they're going to be crying foul very quickly because, this president, our next president is not going to bail out our urban cities. He's going to say, get your house in order. And the Democrats would have bailed him out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, why don't you let us know? Let's bring this to a close. Although we're a little bit over, and I apologize again because we got a late start. Why don't you let us know where we can follow you online and keep an eye on what you're doing?
Sure. So if you want to get more information on my group, you can go to pbtx.com, which is the Professional Bondsman of Texas. So pbtx.com, we have a blog where we highlight important criminal justice stories. We also have our own podcast, which is linked on the menu, but you also can go directly to it because the web address is thebailpost.com. And that's all we do is talk criminal justice issues, thebailpost.com.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.